Tonight, mayors versus Trump.
The Democratic mayors have done they've done some bad work.
Oregon's wolves under fire. And how the Tide Pods thing became a thing.
That's what you wash your shitty drawers with.
Former USA Gymnastics doctor Larry Nassar has been sentenced to between 40 and 175 years in prison for sexual abuse. Judge Rosemarie Aquilina, who opened her courtroom to more than 150 women and girls making victim impact statements, told Nassar she had signed his, quote, death warrant. The physician apologized to his victims today, but Judge Aquilina said she thinks Nassar still doesn't own what he did, and she read passages of a letter he wrote to the court last week, in which he referred to himself as a good doctor who provided effective medical treatment.
The media convinced them that everything I did was wrong and bad. They feel I broke their trust. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned.
Nassar had already been sentenced to 60 years on child pornography charges. At least 4 people were killed in an attack on Save the Children's office in Jalalabad, Afghanistan. A government spokesman said they included 2 of the aid group's employees, a guard, and a member of the police special forces. The Islamic State has claimed responsibility for the attack, which involved a car bomb and an 8-hour gun battle. More than 24 people were injured. The aid organization helps almost 1.4 million Afghan children. And in a statement, they said they were devastated and have temporarily suspended all operations across the country. The European Union has fined Qualcomm $1.2 billion for paying Apple to exclusively use its chips for cellular connectivity in iPhones and iPads. Regulators said that from 2011 to 2016, the company paid Apple billions so it wouldn't buy from competitors.
This meant that no one could challenge Qualcomm effectively in the market for LTE baseband chipsets.
Qualcomm says it disagrees with the decision and will appeal. Apple isn't being fined. Last year, EU regulators also took Google to task for antitrust violations, with a $2.7 billion penalty. An appeals court in Brazil has unanimously upheld the corruption conviction of former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and upped his original 9.5-year sentence to 12 years and 1 month. Lula has been campaigning for another shot at the presidency during his appeals process, and polls have favored him to win the October election. But Brazilian law prohibits candidates with convictions. Lula is expected to appeal to a higher court. President Trump spoke to reporters in an impromptu off-camera Q&A this evening, saying that he's looking forward to being interviewed by special counsel Robert Mueller, and that he doesn't recall asking the acting FBI director who he voted for. Trump also addressed the impasse over immigration, saying that he supports a pathway to citizenship for Dreamers, a top priority for Democrats.
If they do a great job, I think it's a nice thing to have the incentive of, after a period of years, being able to become a citizen.
But earlier in the day, the president went to bat for the right, pissing off a group of mayors to the point where they skipped a scheduled event at the White House.
And the mayors who choose to boycott this event have put the needs of criminal illegal immigrants over law-abiding Americans. But let me tell you, the vast majority of people showed up.
The issue at the heart of the dust-up is whether in Trump's America, liberal cities can make their own rules.
Press conferences in Washington are usually boring, predictable affairs. But today's pro forma presser at the U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting here in Washington went way off script. Just as the press conference got underway, the Trump administration announced a new crackdown on sanctuary cities. The mayors in the room, many of whom lead sanctuary cities, were not happy when they heard the news, which came in the form of a letter from Attorney General Jeff Sessions.
There is an elephant in the room, and I'm going to address it now. I can't ever recall a time in the history of America where this has happened, number one. Number two, I can't ever recall a situation where someone who professes to want to work with other people punches them in the face first and says, now I'd like to talk to you.
The Justice Department told city governments they need to prove they're cooperating with federal immigration enforcement. City governments that refuse will be subpoenaed, the DOJ said. The Trump administration hates sanctuary cities and has vowed to punish them by withdrawing federal funds, a move that's already tied up in the courts. The DOJ letter demands that cities hand over documents that could prove they are, quote, restricting information sharing about immigration enforcement. Big city mayors, who are mostly Democrats, were already at war with the White House on issues including climate change and most prominently immigration.
I want to be clear, we're going to stay a sanctuary city.
We will not be intimidated by the threat to federal funding.
This throwdown only makes it worse. It's now been a year of pitched battle.
It's just not a very tenable time to try to walk into the White House and to have a conversation unless it's going to be productive, and we just didn't believe that conversation would be productive.
Mayor Michael Hancock had been in charge of Denver, Colorado since 2011. I asked him about the differences between this administration and the last one.
There were times when I was at this conference when all of a sudden we get a last-minute phone call from the White House, and a group of us will go over to the White House and help the president prepare his State of the Union address. Those are the kind of things that President Obama did.
You getting those calls now? No. That's the answer to that. I understand. Big cities like to think of themselves as islands, but their relationship to the federal government is actually really important. So when moments like today's press conference happen, when that relationship seems to be broken, you're not crazy to be worried.
And I think you're the President of the United States. You're supposed to be the most powerful office in the world. Act grown up. Show up and say the table's set for a conversation, and then let's have one.
On Tuesday, a 15-year-old boy walked into Marshall County High School in Benton, Kentucky, and started shooting his classmates. He killed 2 students and wounded 15 more. To listen to the media, this was the 11th school shooting in 23 days. But it turns out that number doesn't mean what you think it means. Of those 11 shootings, 5 involved shots being fired where no one was hurt, like a random shot that shattered a window at Cal State San Bernardino. 1 involved a student firing a gun accidentally, and 2 were suicides. That leaves 3 school shootings this year where the shooter intentionally targeted students or staff. That's a little bit ahead of the pace of past years. Over the last 5 years, the U.S. has averaged 30 school shootings a year. That's still a lot of shootings. But surprisingly, even in the post-Columbine, post-Newtown era, the number of students killed by guns in school every year is much lower than it was in the early 1990s. So there is no new school shooting epidemic. But what has risen is the number of shootings like the one in Kentucky. A 2013 FBI study found that the number of active shooter incidents in schools in the 2007 to 2013 period was 44% higher than in the 2000 to 2006 period. There are fewer student deaths from school shootings, but more mass shootings at schools.
Yesterday, President Trump signed an executive order imposing a 30% tariff on solar cell and panel imports.
It won't be a trade war, by the way.
Thanks, everyone. And in some ways, that makes sense. The U.S. solar industry has been booming. According to the Department of Energy, solar-generated electricity rose 5,000% between 2006 and 2016. And in 2016, 39% of all new electricity generation was installed by the solar industry, beating all other sources for the very first time. So it might seem like a good moment to impose a tariff that pushes consumer demand towards US-made products. But there's a problem with that. Solar panel manufacturers in the US only make up 15% of the industry. And most of the money that goes towards solar in this country is spent on American installers putting South Korean, Malaysian, and Chinese solar panels on roofs. That means that this new tariff will probably be bad for more than 80% of the American solar industry. Here's what Clark Packard, the trade policy counsel at the conservative think tank R Street Institute, had to say about the president's announcement.
A tariff is basically nothing more than a regressive sales tax. If it's a $100 solar panel and you add a 30% tariff, that solar panel is now going to cost $130. Many of the jobs in the solar industry at this point are blue-collar jobs installing panels, for instance. It's estimated that it's going to reduce solar installations by 10% over 5 years and cost an estimated 23,000 jobs in the first year alone. And it's going to hit a lot of the people that the president claims he wants to protect, which are sort of blue-collar domestic jobs.
Overall, it looks like the 30% tariff could increase the cost of solar energy by 10 to 15 cents per watt. Given that the average cost of utility-scale solar power in the US is $1 per watt, that could add up for consumers. As for the effect on manufacturers, Packard says it's basically too little too late. And he's not alone. Micah Loram is an Indiana-based solar panel installer that I interviewed last year.
It is a possibility that this tariff will make me buy U.S. panels. But on the other side, it's not 100% certain that I will, because the U.S. panels already cost about 20 to 30% more than what the overseas panels cost. I can see that being a toss-up, but at the same time, if the U.S. will not be able to keep up with demand, it looks like I'm still going to be purchasing my panels, from another country.
The end result is that customers might see the price tag for panel installation and look for electricity elsewhere. And people who stick with solar will likely have to pay more for their panels than they would have otherwise, regardless of where those panels come from.
Який, на превеликий жаль, після того, куди туди потрапляє.
Напроти мого кабінету знаходиться зал судових засідань, в якому зазвичай проводили судові засідання. Тепер 2,5 роки, навіть уже більше. Повноваження не здійснюю, проте кожен день приходжу на роботу.
Larissa Golnick's trouble started 3 years ago, when a corruption case against the city mayor landed in her courtroom. Alexander Mamai had been accused of helping a relative acquire city land. After he was charged, he did what often happens in Ukraine. He tried to pay off the judge. But Golnick refused to play ball. She taped her meeting with the mayor and released it to the prosecutor.
Треба просто любим путем, я так вважаю, що треба розкрити цю справу. Визнали та й визнали, але відповідальності немає ніякої.
У нас є наш закон, який зобов'язує, що я повинна почути вас. Ваші пояснення в суді. Прийдіть і дайте пояснення, ніяких проблем.
Давайте ви ще переночуєте з цією думкою.
It was a bold move for a provincial judge in Poltava, 200 miles outside Kiev. But the gambit didn't go quite as planned. The mayor denied he did anything wrong. He was later reelected. And then she said she was sent a message for her whistleblowing, attacked as she and her husband walked home.
Напали двоє в чорному, в такому в темному одязі, з капюшони, прикрите обличчя, і в руках у них були щось таке, як нагадую, палиці, дуби, кійки. Але от реально, якби мене чоловік не зустрічав з роботи, мабуть, мене б вбили.
Golnick was one of many Ukrainians who'd been filled with hope in 2014 when a pro-EU, youth-driven popular uprising forced out the country's corrupt and aging government. But since those promising days, the country's progress has often felt stagnant. Top officials may have resigned, but much of the economy remains in the hands of the same few wealthy oligarchs. And corruption, one of the key drivers of the Maidan protests, still seems to be everywhere. In recent weeks, that's led some Ukrainians back onto the streets and rallying to the call of an unlikely leader, Mikhail Saakashvili, the former president of Georgia who's been convicted of corruption charges in his home country, but has remade himself here as a populist rabble-rouser.
Ви мене звільнили, а я зараз зобов'язаний разом з вами звільнити Україну. Від бариг, від корупціонерів, від олігархів.
Saakashvili first appeared in Ukraine in 2015 at the invitation of the then reformist president Petro Poroshenko to help clean up one of the country's most dysfunctional cities. But the friendship between the two men soured.
И сейчас голос свободы с улицы, с главной улицы Украины. И этот голос обязательно заглушит брехню Порошенко, подлость Порошенко.
Now, disenchanted and stripped of his honorary citizenship, he leads almost weekly protests in Kiev's Independence Square, home of the original revolution.
Misha, what are you trying to accomplish here?
Well, we are trying to do an anti-oligarchy revolution.
After this one, he tried to lead protesters to take over the October Palace, a nearby city building. The police were there in force.
Was that a failure back there? Were you trying to get into that building?
No. If we had gone in quietly, that's one thing.
Right.
We cannot allow them to incite violence. And they basically are ready to war violence. And violence, this is not our style.
Right.
If we see violence, we just back off. We just don't go with violence against violence.
So now you're pulling back now because of that?
Yes, because it was like absolutely peaceful intention to hold another meeting there.
The protest was a strategic disaster for Saakashvili, and it captured perfectly the awkwardness of his role. Both outsider and insider, he has a keen sense of the frustrations of a certain part of the country, and yet the support of only a tiny fraction, 2% by one recent poll. Much of the traditional opposition shuns his approach.
I would disagree with Mr. Saakashvili. All revolutions, they are a moment of inspiration, but you'll get sober one day, right?
Svetlana Zaleschuk was a protester during Maidan, who now serves in the parliament as one of its youngest members.
Is Ukraine in a crisis now over corruption?
Good question. Crisis. Yes, I think so. I believe during the last 3 years we adopted more positive and progressive legislation that we've done for the previous 23 years. But the problem is really that many of them are still remain policies, laws, which is not necessarily practice and culture.
How does the next round of changes happen? Does it come from in here in the parliament, or does it come from the people in the tents on the street?
We overdid a little bit with revolutions. And we need evolution because revolutions have too many sacrifices, too many losses.
Saakashvili calls this naive.
They've been trying to achieve something, and it's hard to admit that we had initial successes, but now we're failing. And it's hard to now acknowledge that, well, whatever we did just went into the sand. It's not there anymore.
Are you the right person to do this? I mean, you're not Ukrainian.
No, I'm not. I'm definitely not the only right person to do it, and I'm not the main right person to do it, for simple reasons. I've not been born here. I've heavily invested emotion in this country. Yes, we need Ukrainian leaders, and I'm desperately looking for them.
Other people in the opposition, I think they would agree with your diagnosis, but they don't agree that taking to the streets, having another revolution is the right response.
Well, otherwise we have to resign ourselves to the idea that Ukraine will fail and it will disintegrate.
Larissa Golnick continues to wait as a series of lawsuits plays out. She thinks a little more patience is what's needed now.
Has nothing changed since 2014?
Дещо змінилося, і дуже повільно, але змінилося. Розумію, що революції не завжди можуть вирішити ті проблеми, які існують.
All right, here we go.
By now, you've probably heard of the Tide Pod Challenge. Maybe your parents called to warn you that teenagers are eating laundry pods for YouTube views. Or maybe you saw it while you were watching CNN in an airport lounge.
And once again, telling teenagers not to do it says, do it, do it, do it.
As a meme, it follows a familiar pattern, taking something that is a real but rare problem In this case, small children accidentally eating detergent
I just figured they got into candy and they were eating candy.
and turning it into a sort of meta commentary on how teenagers think adults view them. Kind of like 2013's Cutting Yourself So Justin Bieber Will Stop Smoking Weed, or 2009's Killing for Slender Man.
I saw a segment talking about how kids were eating them because they looked like candy, and I thought it was funny.
Like any meme, it's hard to pinpoint the origin, but just a few months after Tide released the pods in 2012, Mitchell Banks made this tweet, which just might make him patient zero.
I was a freshman in high school. I tweeted to Daniel Tosh as a joke. I thought it'd be funny if he tweeted back.
For a few years, nothing much happened. But then, by the magic of the internet, the meme became a thing. According to Twitter, of 1.8 million tweets since 2013 that mention the words Tide Pod, over 85% have been from the past month. Most people are just joking, but there have been some real-world consequences. In all of 2017, the American Association of Poison Control Centers received 53 reports of teenagers intentionally ingesting single-use laundry detergent pods. This year, we're already up to 86 reports. To combat this surge of self-inflicted poisonings, Facebook and YouTube have started aggressively removing Tide Pod Challenge videos from their sites. Results for Tide Pod Challenge on YouTube today are mainly YouTubers using SEO to squeeze out the last bits of available social capital from the meme by posting videos like this one.
No fucking way am I gonna bite into a Tide Pod. Are you fucking crazy?
That's what you wash your shitty drawers with. What in the world is wrong with our country?
It's kind of a virtue in tricking people. I do think it's weird that the adults take the Tide Pod Challenge so seriously. I don't think I'll be tweeting any more challenges, but if I do, it was probably as a joke, and maybe in a few years, people won't take it as a joke and actually do it.
Wolves nearly disappeared in the U.S. by the 1940s. Ranchers saw them as a threat to their cattle and collected a bounty from the government to go after them. But in the mid-1990s, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service started to reintroduce gray wolves in parts of Idaho, looking to control deer and elk populations. The wolves eventually migrated west to Oregon, and ranchers losing livestock are up in arms once again. Last year, for the first time in its history, the state issued permits that lets them fight back.
Todd Nash has been a rancher for most of his adult life.
Get him out of there!
But it's only in the last decade that he's had to deal with his cows being massacred in his fields.
Mary. Around the 1st of March in 2007, right here on this little hill, and I found a calf that had been about 90% consumed.
The killers were gray wolves. During the last 7 years, Nash estimates he's lost more than 100 cows to wolf depredation, the legal term for kills made by a carnivore. Under Oregon law, the state reimburses Nash for cows killed by wolves. But Nash says the money doesn't cover his losses, which he says total about $50,000. And what he really wants isn't more compensation, it's more leeway to kill wolves.
In a lot of places, including Oregon, the presence of the wolf is the presence of the wild. Can you understand how that is so attractive to people?
Yeah, I think that there's something very visceral about hearing a wolf howl. You know, growing up and reading Jack London stories, and I had those same feelings, and I was the least bit concerned about wolves before they came here. It's different when it's your livestock being killed.
There are 4 legal avenues for killing a wolf in Northeast Oregon. If a wolf is caught in the act of attacking a cow, or if a wolf is attacking a human, it's permissible to shoot it. Oregon will also send its own hunters out if a rancher can gather evidence showing 2 cows have been lost to wolves. Then last summer, the state did something new, offering ranchers a special permit to hunt problem wolves themselves, as long as they could meet those same burdens of proof. It's the compromise the state has reached, killing fewer wolves than ranchers want, but more than conservationists think is necessary. Bob Clavins and Wally Sykes are Eastern Oregon environmentalists monitoring the woods for signs of wolves. They're afraid that with the special permits, Oregon is taking a step toward legalized wolf hunting.
This may be the last time we look at this camera until spring.
How much time is on that?
I think the last time, Wally, we checked these in October last, like mid-October, so it's been a while. So there's a good chance a lot of stuff has come by in the interim.
Humans, cars, it's nothing. Oh, now let's look here. Now what's this? That, gentlemen, correct me if I'm wrong.
That's a wolf.
That is a big wolf, man.
Clavins works for a group called Oregon Wild, which sued the state in 2015 after wolves were taken off Oregon's endangered species list. Oregon Wild has pushed the state to enforce its requirement that ranchers try non-lethal wolf deterrents before asking for permission to kill a wolf.
You know, Oregon is home to over 1.3 million cows. The last years we have statistics, over 55,000 died from things like weather, disease, domestic dogs, calving, human thieves. Wolves took this year and this year where there's so much conflict, a few dozen. The idea that it's this humongous threat, that just doesn't match the reality. I'm a small business owner. My wife and I have a small farm in bed and breakfast. If somebody came in and told us we have to do things differently, I'd be pretty resistant to it too. I totally understand that. But at the same time, if your business model depends on killing rare wildlife to turn a profit in the 21st century, that might be a flawed business model.
A 7-person commission appointed by Oregon's governor will vote on a new wolf plan this spring. The plan makes it a little harder to kill a wolf. A pack now has to kill 3 cows instead of the current standard of 2 before wolves can be shot. But the special permits stay. It's not that the people who live and work around cattle hate wolves, any more than they hate the weather that threatens their herds. They just see wolves as a problem that should be solved.
The state of Oregon is at a pretty critical juncture right now in terms of what's going to happen to wolves going forward. Living here, what do you want the rest of Oregon to do?
The wolves are an interesting thing, and they're probably the most emotion-producing animal I've ever known of. My favorite saying is 180 degrees from crazy is still crazy. It doesn't make sense to kill them all. It doesn't make sense to let the wolves do whatever they want and try and live around. They need to be controlled.
When you all hear in town the phrase, shoot, shovel, and shut up when it comes to wolves.
You saw the sticker on the wall there?
Does that ring true, or is that a little too far? What's the judgment on that?
They're just saying if you're going to be that stupid and you're going to shoot one, well, make sure you take care of it properly so nobody knows about it. I'm sure those kinds of things happen because there is so much emotion about it, and it does affect people so significantly in certain places. That's just human nature, I think, to want to strike back, you know.
That's Vice News Tonight for Wednesday, January 24th.